In 1879, Wyoming Nadia Blackwood stood on the gallows moments from death for crimes she didn't commit when a mysterious rancher rode through the rain-soaked crowd and invoked an ancient law that would change 3 lives forever. What happened next defied every rule of civilization and sparked a war that would shake the very foundations of Willow Creek. Stay with me until the end of this incredible true story and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these amazing historical tales travel around the world. The rope creaked ominously in the wind as it swayed from the hastily constructed gallows in Willow Creek's town square. October rain fell in sheets across the muddy streets of Wyoming territory, but not a soul had sought shelter. Every man, woman, and child in the settlement of barely 300 had gathered to witness what Bishop Marcus Harrington proclaimed would be divine justice served upon the heathen. Nadia Blackwood stood barefoot on the wooden platform, her long black hair whipping across her face in the wind. Shackles bound her wrists, the iron having rubbed her skin raw during the 3 days she'd spent in the town's makeshift jail. Yet her dark eyes held no fear, no pleading, no trace of the submission the crowd expected from a condemned woman. Instead, there was something that made grown men shift uncomfortably and look away, a wild dignity that seemed to mock their civilized pretensions. "Look at her," whispered Martha Henderson to her neighbor, clutching her shawl tighter against the rain. "Even now she shows no remorse. No Christian woman would face death with such defiance." The murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but it was tinged with something else, an uncomfortable recognition that this Apache woman possessed a courage none of them could imagine summoning in their final moments. Bishop Harrington stepped forwards, his black coat streaming with rain, his pale eyes blazing with righteous fervor. A man of 45 with prematurely silver hair and the lean build of someone who mistook hunger for holiness, he had arrived in Willow Creek 6 months prior with letters of recommendation from Denver and an immediate plan to bring proper Christian order to what he called this godless frontier. "Citizens of Willow Creek," his voice boomed across the square, somehow audible even above the storm. "We gather today not in celebration, but in solemn duty. This woman," he gestured toward Nadia with dramatic contempt, "stands accused of the foulest crimes known to civilized man: witchcraft, murder, the corruption of innocent souls through heathen practices." A few voices called out, "Amen," but the enthusiasm seemed force-dampened by both the rain and a growing unease that had nothing to do with the weather. Sheriff Tom Sawyer stood to the side of the platform, his weathered face grim beneath the brim of his hat. At 52, he'd seen enough frontier justice to know the difference between law and lynching, and this felt uncomfortably close to the latter. His hand rested uneasily on his gun belt as he scanned the crowd, noting the faces twisted with bloodlust and those few that seemed troubled by what they were witnessing. "The evidence speaks for itself." Harrington continued, his voice rising with theatrical passion. 3 children fell mysteriously ill after this creature was seen gathering herbs near their homes. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, God rest her soul, died under suspicious circumstances shortly after rejecting this woman's offer to help with her difficult pregnancy. And when our brave citizens attempted to question her, she responded with curses in her savage tongue and threats of supernatural retribution. Nadia's lips curved in what might have been a smile. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, cutting through the rain like a blade. "Your God must be very weak if he fears the herbs that heal and the songs that comfort the dying." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Several women crossed themselves, and more than one man took an involuntary step backward. "Blasphemy!" Harrington's face flushed red above his clerical collar. "Even now, at the moment of judgment, she mocks the Almighty. I mock nothing," Nadia replied, her English precise despite its slight accent. "I simply wonder why your God needs you to murder women to prove his power." The executioner, a nervous man named Dale Pritchard, who'd been chosen for the grim duty primarily because he owed money to half the town, fumbled with the noose. His hands shook as he approached Nadia, and when their eyes met, he saw something that made him pause. Not fear or hatred, but a deep sadness that seemed to encompass not just her own fate, but the ugliness of the spectacle itself. "Get on with it, Dale," someone shouted from the crowd. "She's had her say," called another voice. "Time to pay the price." but as Dale lifted the rough hemp rope toward Nadia's neck, she began to sing. The sound that emerged from her throat was unlike anything the citizens of Willow Creek had ever heard. It wasn't the hymns they knew with their measured cadences and familiar melodies. This was something older, wilder, a song that seemed to rise from the earth itself and speak of vast skies, ancient mountains, and the enduring spirits of those who had walked this land long before white men dreamed of taming it. The crowd fell silent, mesmerized despite themselves. Even the rain seemed to quiet as if nature itself paused to listen. The melody was haunting, beautiful, and utterly foreign, a farewell to the world in the language of her people, the Chiricahua Apache. "Stop that heathen wailing," Harrington commanded, but his voice cracked slightly. The song was having an effect he hadn't anticipated. Instead of demonstrating the woman's savagery, it was revealing something uncomfortably human about her final moments. Nadia continued singing, her voice growing stronger. She sang of her grandmother's stories of sacred places hidden in desert canyons, of the spirits of her ancestors who would guide her across the Star Bridge to the land beyond. She sang without tears, without pleading, with a dignity that made several in the crowd begin to question what they were witnessing. Young Timothy Fletcher, barely 16 and attending his first execution, found himself crying without understanding why. The song seemed to reach something deep inside him, something that recognized the profound injustice of what was happening regardless of the crimes alleged. "Enough!" Harrington's composure was cracking. Dale placed that noose immediately. But as the executioner reached for Nadia again, the sound of hoofbeats thundered across the town square. The rhythm was urgent, desperate, cutting through the rain, and the tension like a cavalry charge. Every head turned toward the sound, and through the gray curtain of rain a rider appeared. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, with dark hair plastered to his head by the storm. His horse, a powerful bay stallion, churned mud as it pounded toward the gallows. Behind him, clinging to the saddle, rode a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, his face pale with terror and determination. The rider pulled up just yards from the platform, his horse rearing dramatically as he brought it to a halt. As he dismounted in one fluid motion, the crowd got their first clear look at him, and recognition rippled through the assembly like wildfire. "Jesse Blackwood," Martha Henderson breathed. "Lord Almighty, it's Jesse Blackwood." The name carried weight in Willow Creek and the surrounding territory. Jesse Blackwood owned the largest ranch within 50 miles, the Double B spread, that controlled crucial water rights along Silver Creek. More importantly, he was Eleanor Blackwood's widower, the husband of the very woman whose death had been laid at Nadia's feet. At 34, Jesse cut an imposing figure, even soaked to the skin. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by the kind of lines that came from squinting across vast distances and making hard decisions. His blue eyes, the color of winter sky, blazed with an intensity that made strong men step aside as he strode toward the gallows. "Stop this!" he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Stop this madness right now." Bishop Harrington's mouth fell open in shock. Of all the interruptions he might have expected, this was the least likely. "Mr. Blackwood, what is the meaning of this? This woman is accused of murdering your wife." "I know what she's accused of," Jesse replied grimly. "I also know something you don't." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, its edges worn from handling. "There's an old territorial law passed in '67 and never repealed. A condemned woman can be spared execution if claimed in marriage by a man of good standing." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs and outright gasps. Sheriff Sawyer pushed forward, his hand extended for the document. "Jesse, you can't be serious about this." "Dead serious, Tom." Jesse's jaw was set in a line that those who knew him recognized as immovable. "I invoke the statute of territorial preservation. I claim this woman as my lawful wife." Harrington's face went from red to purple. "This is preposterous. You cannot marry your wife's murderer." "She's not convicted of murder," Jesse shot back. "She's accused of witchcraft, which isn't even a real crime, and of practicing medicine without a license, which carries a fine, not a death sentence. You've trumped up charges to justify a lynching bishop, and every man here knows it." The truth of his words hung in the air like smoke. The crowd began to shift uncomfortably, some looking ashamed for the first time since the proceedings began. Sheriff Sawyer examined the document Jesse had provided, his expression growing more troubled with each line he read. "It's legitimate," he said finally, his voice heavy with reluctance. "The law is still on the books. A woman condemned to death can choose marriage over execution if a suitable man claims her. This is madness, Harrington sputtered. The woman is a savage, a heathen. She cannot be married in a Christian ceremony. The law doesn't specify the type of ceremony, Jesse replied calmly. It just requires the woman's consent and a witness. He turned toward the gallows, his eyes meeting Nadia's for the first time. Well, what's your answer? Nadia had stopped singing when Jesse appeared, but she'd shown no other reaction to the extraordinary scene unfolding below her. Now, as every eye in the town focused on her, she studied the man who'd offered her this impossible escape. She saw strength in his bearing, but also something else, a deep weariness that spoke of recent grief and hard choices. His son, still mounted on the horse, watched her with wide eyes that held neither fear nor hatred, only curiosity. Why? She asked simply. Jesse hesitated, and for a moment the mask of determined authority slipped, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. Because I've seen enough death, he said quietly. And because... He glanced at his son, then back to her. Because Noah needs a mother. The boy on the horse. Noah straightened at the mention of his name. He was small for his age, with his father's blue eyes and hair that was almost black. But there was something about him that caught Nadia's attention immediately, a stillness that seemed unnatural in a child, as if some essential part of him had withdrawn from the world. Nadia looked from father to son, then out at the crowd of faces staring up at her with expressions ranging from horror to fascination. These people had been ready to watch her die for crimes she hadn't committed to satisfy their fear of what they didn't understand. Now, they waited to see if she would choose a life bound to a stranger over death at the end of a rope. I accept, she said clearly. The crowd exploded into chaos. Some shouted in outrage, others in amazement. Women clutched their children closer as if Nadia's reprieve somehow threatened their own safety. Men argued loudly about the legality, the morality, and the sheer audacity of what they'd witnessed. Through it all, Bishop Harrington stood frozen, his carefully orchestrated execution dissolving into farce. His pale eyes blazed with a fury that promised this was far from over. This is an abomination, he shouted over the noise. A mockery of Christian law and decent society I will not allow. You don't have a choice, Sheriff Sawyer interrupted, though he looked as if he'd rather be anywhere else. The law is the law, Bishop. Dale, get those shackles off her. The executioner looked around desperately as if hoping someone would countermand the order. But when no one did, he reluctantly approached Nadia with the key to her bonds. His hands still shook as he unlocked the iron cuffs, and when they fell away, Nadia rubbed her wrists where the metal had chafed her skin raw. Jesse stepped up onto the platform, his boots loud on the wet wood. Up close, Nadia could see the lines of grief etched around his eyes. The tightness in his jaw that spoke of a man holding himself together through sheer will. When he extended his hand to help her down from the gallows, she studied it for a moment, calloused from ranch work, scarred from a lifetime of hard labor, but steady. She took his hand. The crowd parted as they walked through the square, some moving aside, in respect others backing away as if Nadia carried some contagion. Rain continued to fall, turning the dirt streets into mud that sucked at their feet with each step. Behind them, Bishop Harrington's voice rose in increasingly shrill protests, but his words were lost in the storm and the chaos of the dissolving crowd. Jesse's horse waited patiently, and Noah slid forward in the saddle to make room. As Jesse lifted Nadia up behind his son, she found herself face to face with the boy. His eyes were solemn, ancient, in a way that spoke of too much loss for someone so young. Hello, she said softly. Noah stared at her for a long moment, then whispered, Are you really a witch? The question was asked without malice, with the pure curiosity of a child seeking to understand his suddenly transformed world. Nadia considered her answer carefully. I know which plants heal and which harm, she said. I know the songs that ease pain and the stories that bring sleep to troubled minds. Some call that magic. Others call it medicine. What do you think? Noah was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then, unexpectedly, he asked, Can you make my mama come back? The question hit like a physical blow. Jesse's shoulders tensed, and Nadia felt the grief that surrounded this small family like a tangible thing. She reached out slowly and touched Noah's face, her fingers gentle against his rain-wet cheek. "No, little one," she said honestly. "Death is the one door that only opens one way, but I can help make the hurt smaller if you'll let me." Noah considered this with the same grave seriousness he'd shown throughout their brief conversation. Finally, he nodded slightly and turned to face forward again. Jesse mounted behind them, and with a final look at the chaos they were leaving behind, he spurred his horse toward home. As they rode out of Willow Creek, Nadia caught sight of Bishop Harrington standing in the rain, his pale eyes following their departure with an expression of absolute hatred. She had the distinct feeling that while she'd escaped the noose, the real danger was just beginning. The Double B Ranch lay 7 miles west of town, nestled in a valley where Silver Creek meandered through grassland that stretched toward the distant mountains. Even in the rain, Nadia could see it was beautiful country, the kind of vast open landscape that spoke to something deep in her Apache soul. The main house was larger than she'd expected, built of local stone and timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Outbuildings dotted the property: barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, and corrals that could hold hundreds of head of cattle. As they approached, several ranch hands emerged from the barn, their faces registering shock at the sight of Jesse riding double with a strange woman and his son. Word traveled fast on the frontier, and Nadia had no doubt that news of the day's events would reach the ranch before they did. Jesse brought the horse to a halt in front of the main house and dismounted, then lifted Noah down before turning to help Nadia. As her feet touched the ground, she became acutely aware of her situation barefoot, still wearing the simple dress she'd been arrested in 3 days earlier, standing in the rain before a house that was supposed to be her home, but felt as foreign as the moon. "Frank," Jesse called out to one of the hands, a grizzled man in his 50s with kind eyes and a cautious expression. "Take care of Ranger, will you?" "Sure thing, boss," Frank replied, but his gaze kept drifting to Nadia with poorly concealed curiosity. Everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Jesse said firmly, though the tightness in his voice suggested otherwise. "This is Nadia. She'll be staying with us." The understatement of the century, Nadia thought wryly. She was about to become Jesse's wife in the eyes of the law stepmother to his grieving son and mistress of a ranch she'd never seen before today. The magnitude of what she'd agreed to was beginning to sink in, but even so, it seemed preferable to the alternative she'd faced that morning. Jesse led them up the porch steps and opened the front door, ushering Nadia and Noah inside. The interior was comfortable but unmistakably masculine: heavy furniture, neutral colors, and a layer of dust that spoke of a household without a woman's touch. Photographs on the mantelpiece showed a beautiful blonde woman who must have been Eleanor, often posed with Jesse and Noah in happier times. "You must be cold," Jesse said suddenly, seeming to realize that his unexpected wife was soaked through and shivering. "There's a spare room upstairs. I'll get you some dry clothes." He paused, looking uncomfortable. They belonged to Eleanor. I hope you don't mind." Nadia nodded, understanding the awkwardness of the situation for all of them. "That's very kind." Noah had been silent since they arrived, but now he tugged on his father's coat. "Papa, I'm hungry." "Of course you are." Jesse's expression softened as he looked at his son. "Why don't you go wash up while I show Nadia to her room, then we'll see about some supper." As Noah disappeared down a hallway, Jesse led Nadia up a narrow staircase to the 2nd floor. The house felt larger on the inside than it had appeared from outside, with several bedrooms and a bathroom that featured actual running water, a luxury in this remote part of Wyoming. "This was the guest room," Jesse said, opening a door to reveal a simply furnished space with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the valley. "It's not much, but it's private." "It's perfect," Nadia said honestly. After 3 days in a jail cell, any clean, dry space felt like paradise. Jesse opened the dresser and withdrew several items of clothing: a dark blue dress, undergarments, stockings. His movements were careful, almost reverent, as he handled what had obviously been his wife's belongings. "She was about your size," he said quietly. "Maybe a little taller." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them as the reality of their situation settled in. They were strangers bound together by law and circumstance, sharing a house that still echoed with the memory of another woman's presence. "Jesse," Nadia said carefully, "I want you to know that I understand what this is. You saved my life today, and I'm grateful, but I don't expect That is, I won't presume to take Eleanor's place in your life or in Noah's." Something flickered in Jesse's eyes, relief perhaps, or maybe disappointment. It was impossible to tell. "I appreciate that," he said. "This arrangement, it's not conventional, but Noah does need stability and you need protection. Maybe we can help each other." It was a practical arrangement, clearly defined and bloodlessly rational, so why did Nadia feel a small stab of something that might have been disappointment? "There is one thing," Jesse continued, his voice growing harder. "Bishop Harrington isn't going to let this go. He had his heart set on making an example of you, and powerful men don't like being thwarted. You'll be safe here on the ranch, but if you go into town—" "I understand," Nadia replied. She'd seen the hatred in Harrington's eyes, the way the crowd had looked at her. Safety was relative, and she was under no illusions about her welcome in Willow Creek. "I'll leave you to get changed," Jesse said, moving toward the door. "Come down when you're ready. We'll have some supper and figure out how to make this work." After he left, Nadia stood alone in the strange room, surrounded by the belongings of a dead woman whose husband she'd just married. The absurdity of the situation might have been funny under different circumstances, but there was nothing amusing about the grief that permeated this house or the danger that still lurked in the town they'd left behind. She changed into Eleanor's dress, surprised by how well it fit. The fabric was good quality wool, warm and soft against her skin. In the mirror above the dresser, she caught sight of herself and paused. Dressed in civilized clothes, her long hair combed and falling in dark waves past her shoulders, she looked different. Not quite like the savage the townspeople expected, but not entirely like them either. She existed in some middle ground, belonging fully to neither world. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Nadia." It was Noah's voice, small and uncertain. "Come in," she called. The boy peered around the door, his blue eyes wide and serious. He'd washed and changed into clean clothes, and his dark hair was neatly combed. For a moment he just stared at her, taking in her transformation from condemned prisoner to properly dressed lady. "You look different," he said finally. "Do I look better or worse?" Nadia asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Noah considered this with the gravity he seemed to bring to all questions. "Different," he repeated, "but not scary different, just different." "That's probably the best I can hope for," Nadia said with a small smile. "Papa says supper's ready," Noah announced. "He made beans and cornbread. It's not very good, but it's food." The honest assessment made Nadia's smile widen. "Well, I'm very hungry, so even not very good food sounds wonderful right now." Noah nodded solemnly and turned to go, then paused. "Miss Nadia, are you really my new mama now?" The question was asked with such innocent directness that it took Nadia's breath away. How did you explain to an 8-year-old that his father had married a stranger to save her from hanging? How did you make him understand that love and family couldn't be created by legal documents and desperate circumstances? "I'm your papa's wife now," she said carefully. "But being a mama is something that has to grow between people. It can't be forced or rushed. Do you understand?" Noah nodded, though she wasn't sure he really grasped the complexity of what she was trying to explain. "Will you try?" he asked. The simple question asked with such hope and vulnerability hit Nadia harder than any accusation or condemnation she'd faced. This little boy had lost his mother and was now looking to a complete stranger for comfort and care. The responsibility was overwhelming, but it was also something else, an opportunity to matter again, to be more than just a condemned woman waiting to die. "Yes," she said softly. "I'll try." Noah's face lit up with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "Good," he said simply, then scampered down the stairs to tell his father that their new family member was ready for supper. Nadia followed more slowly, her mind reeling with the events of the day. 12 hours ago, she'd been waiting to die. Now she was married to a man she'd never met, stepmother to a grieving child and mistress of a ranch in the middle of nowhere. The future stretched ahead of her, uncertain and fraught with challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But as she descended the stairs toward the warm light of the kitchen, where Jesse and Noah waited with simple food and complicated hopes, Nadia felt something she hadn't experienced in months: possibility. Whatever came next, whatever dangers awaited in the form of Bishop Harrington's wrath or the town's rejection, she was alive. She had been given a second chance, and she intended to make the most of it. The aroma of beans and fresh cornbread filled the kitchen, and for the first time since her arrest, Nadia felt truly hungry. As she took her place at the table across from her new husband and beside her new son, she realized that sometimes salvation came not in the form you expected, but in the form you needed most. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the mud and blood of the day's drama. But inside the warm kitchen of the Double B Ranch, three unlikely souls began the delicate process of becoming a family bound not by love or blood, but by mutual need and the fragile hope that sometimes even the most desperate arrangements could grow into something real. The first week at the Double B Ranch passed in a careful dance of adjustment and unspoken boundaries. Nadia found herself navigating the delicate territory between guest and family member, acutely aware that every gesture was being observed and evaluated by both Jesse and Noah. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting to see whether this strange new arrangement would take root or wither under the weight of its own impossibility. Jesse maintained a polite distance, treating her with the courtesy due a lady, but never quite forgetting the circumstances that had brought her there. He rose before dawn each morning to tend to ranch business, often returning only for meals that passed in stilted conversation about weather cattle and other safe topics. Noah, meanwhile, watched her with the intense curiosity of a child trying to solve a puzzle, following her movements around the house and asking questions that revealed both his hunger for maternal attention and his lingering uncertainty about her place in their world. "Do you really know medicine?" he asked one morning as Nadia hung laundry on the line behind the house. The October air was crisp, and her breath formed small clouds as she worked. "Some," she replied, pinning one of Jesse's shirts to the rope. "My grandmother taught me about plants and their uses, different tribes, different knowledge." "What kind of plants?" Nadia paused, considering how much to reveal. The townspeople had called her healing knowledge witchcraft, and she had no desire to frighten the boy. Willow bark for pain, echinacea for fighting sickness, sage for cleansing wounds, simple things that grow in nature. Noah absorbed this information with the same gravity he brought to all their conversations. "Mama got sick when the baby was coming. The doctor from town couldn't help her." The statement hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and loss. Nadia set down the wet shirt she'd been holding and knelt to Noah's eye level. "I'm sorry about your mama, Noah. Losing someone you love is the hardest thing in the world." "Papa doesn't talk about her anymore," Noah said quietly. "He gets sad when I ask questions." Grief affects people differently. Some need to talk, others need silence. Neither way is wrong. "Which way are you?" The question caught Nadia off guard. She thought of her own losses, her family killed in an army raid when she was 16, her brief marriage to a man who died of fever 2 years later, the children she'd never been able to carry to term. "I suppose I'm somewhere in between. I remember the people I've lost, but I try not to let the sadness swallow me whole." Noah nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. "Will you teach me about the plants?" "If your father approves, yes." That evening, when Jesse returned from checking the cattle in the south pasture, Noah immediately cornered him with an earnest request to learn about medicine plants from Nadia. Jesse's reaction was measured, cautious. "I don't know, son. The townspeople already think—" He trailed off, glancing at Nadia, who was stirring a pot of stew on the stove. "They think I'm a witch," she finished calmly. "But knowledge itself isn't evil, Jesse. The ability to heal shouldn't be feared." Jesse studied her for a long moment, weighing her words against the prejudices of his neighbors. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I suppose there's no harm in understanding what grows around us, but Noah, this stays between us family members." "Understood." The casual reference to her as family sent an unexpected warmth through Nadia's chest, even as she recognized it was likely an unconscious slip rather than a deliberate inclusion. The next afternoon, while Jesse was in town conducting business, Nadia took Noah on a walk along Silver Creek to identify useful plants. The boy proved an eager student, asking detailed questions about root systems, growing seasons, and preparation methods. As they knelt beside a patch of wild mint, examining the serrated leaves and discussing their uses for stomach ailments, Nadia felt the first genuine moment of peace she'd experienced since arriving at the ranch. "Miss Nadia," Noah said suddenly, "why were those people so angry at you?" The question was inevitable, but it still caught her unprepared. How did you explain hatred and prejudice to a child? How did you make him understand that sometimes people feared what they didn't recognize? "People are often afraid of things they don't understand," she said carefully. When someone looks different or knows different things, some folks think that makes them dangerous. But you're not dangerous. You're teaching me about healing. No, I'm not dangerous, but fear doesn't always listen to reason. Noah picked a sprig of mint and examined it closely. Papa says fear makes people do stupid things sometimes. Your papa is a wise man. He says you're brave. This surprised her. He said that last night when he was reading to me before bed, I asked him why you didn't cry on that day. He said you were the bravest person he'd ever seen. Nadia felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. She hadn't realized Jesse had formed any opinion of her character beyond the practical necessity of their arrangement. What else did he say? That brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what's right even when you are scared. He's right about that too. They continued their plant gathering in comfortable silence, filling a basket with specimens that Nadia would later dry and prepare for various medicinal uses. As they worked, she became aware of being watched. At first, she attributed the feeling to her own heightened awareness. 3 months of imprisonment and persecution had taught her to be alert to danger. But the sensation persisted, and finally, she spotted the source. A man sat on horseback on the ridge above them, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. Even at a distance, something about his posture and the way he held himself suggested hostile intent rather than casual observation. When he realized he'd been spotted, the figure wheeled his horse and disappeared over the ridge. Noah, Nadia said quietly. We should head back to the house. But we haven't finished. Now, Noah. Something in her tone made the boy respond immediately. They gathered their things quickly and walked back toward the ranch at a pace that was brisk, but not quite running. Nadia's eyes scanned the surrounding landscape continuously, but she saw no further sign of their observer. That evening, when Jesse returned from town, she described the incident to him. His expression grew dark as she spoke. Did you recognize the horse? He asked. No, but something about the way he sat. It felt deliberate, like he was making sure I saw him. Jesse was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire that crackled in the stone fireplace. There's been talk in town, he said finally. Harrington's been holding prayer meetings, rallying people against what he calls the corruption in our midst. Some folks are listening. What kind of talk? The kind that suggests our marriage isn't legitimate, that you're still a danger to the community. He looked at her directly. The kind that might lead to vigilante action if people work themselves up enough. Nadia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening. What do you want me to do? Stay close to the house when I'm not here. Don't go anywhere alone, especially not into town. And if anything feels wrong, anything at all, you find me immediately. Jesse, she said carefully, you don't have to do this. If having me here puts you and Noah in danger. We're family now, he interrupted, and this time the words were deliberate, not accidental. That means we protect each other, all of us. The warmth that spread through her chest at his declaration was immediately followed by fear. She'd brought danger to these people who'd shown her kindness, and the weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. 3 days later, the first real test of their new family bonds arrived in the form of Sheriff Tom Sawyer, who rode up to the house just as they were finishing breakfast. His expression was grim, and he dismounted with the careful movements of a man carrying unwelcome news. Morning, Jesse, he said, touching the brim of his hat. Ma'am? He nodded to Nadia, then glanced at Noah. Might be better if the boy went inside for this conversation. Jesse's jaw tightened. Noah, go start on your arithmetic lessons. We'll be in shortly. After the boy disappeared into the house, Sheriff Sawyer removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. I'm afraid I've got some troubling news. There was an incident in town yesterday evening. What kind of incident? Jesse's voice was carefully controlled. Someone threw a rock through the window of Chen's general store, had a note tied to it. Sawyer pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, said that anyone who trades with Indian lovers would face consequences. Jesse took the note and read it, his expression growing darker with each word. You think this is connected to Nadia? I think Bishop Harrington's been very effective at stirring up sentiment, and Chen made the mistake of mentioning that he'd be happy to extend credit to Mrs. Blackwood if she needed supplies. Nadia felt her stomach clench. An innocent man was being threatened because of her presence in their community. Has Mr. Chen been hurt? Not physically, no, but he's scared. His family's scared, and frankly, so am I. Sawyer's expression was troubled. This kind of thing has a way of escalating, especially when you've got someone like Harrington fanning the flames. What do you suggest? Jesse asked. Honestly, I think it might be best if Mrs. Blackwood stayed away from town for a while. Let things calm down. How long is a while? Nadia asked quietly. Sawyer shrugged helplessly. Until people find something else to focus their anger on, I suppose. Or until Harrington moves on to his next crusade. That could be months, Jesse pointed out. Nadia is a member of this community, now legally married and entitled to the same freedoms as any other citizen. Legal and practical are two different things, Jesse, and you know it. I'm trying to prevent bloodshed here. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but the conclusion was inevitable. For her own safety and that of others, Nadia would avoid town until the current wave of hostility subsided. It was a reasonable precaution that felt like a prison sentence. After Sheriff Sawyer left, Jesse found Nadia standing on the front porch, staring out at the vast landscape that surrounded the ranch. Her expression was unreadable, but her posture spoke of deep resignation. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for what you didn't create this situation. I brought you into it, though, made you part of our family without fully considering what that would mean. Nadia turned to look at him, surprised by the regret in his voice. Do you regret it? Saving me? Jesse was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. No, he said finally. I don't regret saving you, but I regret that doing the right thing has put you in a different kind of cage. A cage with clean clothes, good food, and people who treat me with kindness, Nadia pointed out. I've known worse prisons. That doesn't make it right. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Noah play with a litter of barn kittens near the stable. The boys' laughter carried on the wind, a sound of pure joy that seemed to lighten the weight of their adult concerns. He's different since you came, Jesse observed. Happier, more like he was before his mother died. Yes. Jesse's voice was rough with emotion. Eleanor's death hit him hard. He stopped talking for almost a month afterward, stopped playing, stopped being a child. Having you here, it's given him something to focus on besides grief. He's a remarkable boy. You should be proud. I am, but I worry about him too. About what growing up in this isolation will do to him. Nadia understood the deeper concern behind Jesse's words. The ranch was becoming a sanctuary, but it was also becoming a prison. Noah needed contact with other children, exposure to different ideas and experiences. But as long as the town viewed their family as a threat, those opportunities would be limited. Perhaps, she said carefully, we could arrange for Noah to spend time with other families, children who live farther from town, where the bishop's influence is less strong. Jesse considered this. The Andersons live about 15 miles north. Good people, 3 kids around Noah's age. Jim Anderson and I have done business for years. Would they welcome Noah despite the circumstances? Jim's not the kind of man who judges a child for his parents' choices. I think he'd be glad to have Noah visit. It was a small solution to a large problem, but it represented hope, the possibility that Noah's world didn't have to shrink simply because his father had chosen to do the right thing. That evening, as they gathered around the dinner table, Jesse broached the subject of visits to the Anderson ranch. Noah's eyes lit up with excitement at the prospect of playing with other children, and his enthusiasm was infectious. For the first time since Sheriff Sawyer's visit, the mood in the house lifted. Can Miss Nadia come too? Noah asked innocently. Jesse and Nadia exchanged glances across the table. We'll see, Jesse said diplomatically. For now, let's focus on arranging a visit for you. After Noah went to bed, Jesse and Nadia found themselves alone in the living room, a situation that had become increasingly common but no less awkward. Jesse worked on ranch ledgers while Nadia mended clothes. The domestic scene marred only by the careful distance they maintained and the unspoken tensions that filled the space between them. Jesse, Nadia said suddenly, setting down her needlework, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. He looked up from his account books, giving her his full attention. All right. Do you believe I killed Eleanor? The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy and choking. Jesse set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, studying Nadia's face in the flickering lamplight. "No," he said finally. "I don't." "Why not? Everyone else seems convinced of my guilt." Jesse was quiet for a long moment, marshaling his thoughts. "Because I was there when Eleanor died," he said quietly. "I saw what happened, and it wasn't murder. It was tragedy." Nadia felt her heart skip a beat. "What do you mean?" Jesse stood and walked to the mantelpiece where Eleanor's photograph smiled down at them from a silver frame. Eleanor had difficulties with childbirth from the beginning. 3 miscarriages before Noah and his birth nearly killed her. When she got pregnant again last spring, the doctor advised against it, said her body couldn't handle another pregnancy. But she continued anyway. She wanted another child desperately, said Noah needed a sibling, that a family wasn't complete with just one child. Jesse's voice was thick with old pain. I tried to talk her out of it, but Eleanor was determined. When she made up her mind about something, there was no changing it. What happened? Problems from the start. She was sick constantly, couldn't keep food down, dizzy spells that left her bedridden for days. Doc Morrison came out twice a week, but there wasn't much he could do except warn us that things weren't going well. Jesse fell silent, lost in the painful memories. Nadia waited, sensing that this was a story that needed to be told completely. "The bleeding started in her 7th month, Jesse continued. Doc Morrison said the baby wasn't positioned right, that Eleanor needed surgery if either of them was going to survive. But the nearest hospital was in Denver, 3 days hard travel, and she was too weak to make the journey. So you sent for me." "Eleanor sent for you. She'd heard from some of the Mexican women who worked seasonal jobs on nearby ranches that there was an Apache woman living in the hills who knew about difficult births. Against my better judgment, I agreed to let her try." Nadia felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "But I couldn't save her." "You tried everything. Herbs to stop the bleeding, positioning techniques to turn the baby prayers in your language and ours. You worked for 18 hours straight, never giving up even when it was clear." Jesse's voice broke slightly. "Even when it was clear that nothing was going to save them." "I'm sorry," Nadia whispered. "I'm so sorry I couldn't do more." "You stayed with her at the end. When the pain got too bad and Doc Morrison's laudanum ran out, you sang to her, that Apache song. It seemed to give her peace. Her last words were to thank you for trying." Tears ran down Nadia's cheeks as she absorbed the full tragedy of Eleanor's death and her own unwitting role in the events that followed. "Then why did they accuse me of murder?" Jesse's expression hardened, because 3 days after the funeral, Bishop Harrington arrived in town with his own version of events. He convinced people that you'd used witchcraft to kill Eleanor and the baby, that your heathen practices had somehow caused the deaths rather than trying to prevent them. But you were there. You knew the truth. I was grieving and half mad with loss. When Harrington started spreading his poison, I should have spoken up, should have defended you. Instead, I retreated to the ranch and tried to drink away the pain. By the time I sobered up enough to realize what was happening, you'd already been arrested." The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Nadia understood now why Jesse had risked everything to save her from the gallows. It wasn't just an act of mercy, but an attempt at redemption for his own perceived failures. "Is that why you married me?" she asked quietly. "Guilt." Jesse considered the question carefully before answering. "Partly," he admitted, "but not entirely. Watching you face that crowd, seeing your courage in the face of death, I realized that anyone brave enough to try to save my wife's life, brave enough to sing her to peaceful rest, didn't deserve to die for the townspeople's fears and prejudices. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was something perhaps more valuable, respect and understanding, born from shared tragedy." Nadia felt some of the tension she'd been carrying since their marriage begin to ease. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I needed to know." "There's more," Jesse said grimly. "Something I haven't told you about Harrington." Nadia felt her stomach clench with foreboding. "What?" "He didn't come to Willow Creek by accident. He was sent here by someone with specific instructions to clean up the territory, make it more acceptable to potential investors and railroad companies. Having an Apache woman practicing medicine and living freely among white settlers didn't fit their vision of civilized progress." "You think my arrest was planned?" "I think you were targeted from the moment Harrington arrived. Eleanor's death just gave him the excuse he needed." The implications of this revelation sent a chill through Nadia. If Jesse was right, then her persecution hadn't been random violence born of fear and prejudice, but a calculated campaign designed to remove her from the territory entirely. And if that was true, then Bishop Harrington wouldn't be satisfied with simply driving her into hiding. He would keep pushing until he achieved his original goal. "Who sent him?" she asked. "I don't know for certain, but I have suspicions. There's been talk for months about a railroad spur line coming through this area. The route would require significant land purchases and water rights negotiations. Having undesirable elements in the population could complicate those deals." "You think someone wants the railroad to come through here?" "I think someone stands to make a lot of money from the railroad coming through here, and I think they're willing to destroy lives to smooth the way." The conversation was interrupted by a sound from upstairs, Noah crying out in his sleep, caught in the grip of another nightmare. Both adults rose immediately, but Jesse gestured for Nadia to stay back. "Let me," he said quietly. He still sometimes gets confused when he wakes up in the dark. But as Jesse headed for the stairs, Noah's cries grew more distressed, and suddenly Nadia heard him calling her name. Miss Nadia, where are you?" Jesse paused, looking back at her with surprise. "He's asking for you." Together they climbed the stairs and entered Noah's room. The boy was sitting up in bed, his hair tousled and his cheeks wet with tears. When he saw Nadia, he reached for her with desperate urgency. "I dreamed you went away," he sobbed as she sat on the edge of his bed and gathered him into her arms. "I dreamed the bad men came and took you away like they took Mama." "Shh," Nadia murmured, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." "Promise?" The word was muffled against her shoulder, but the desperate need behind it was clear. Nadia looked over Noah's head at Jesse, who stood in the doorway, watching with an expression of profound sadness, and something else, perhaps recognition that his son's heart had already claimed this woman as family, regardless of the circumstances that had brought her to them. "I promise," Nadia said softly, hoping it was a vow she would be able to keep. As Noah's breathing gradually evened out and he drifted back to sleep, still clinging to her hand, Nadia found herself thinking about the strange turns that had brought her to this moment. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a solitary woman living on the margins of society, helping where she could, but belonging nowhere. Now, she was part of a family responsible for a grieving child's emotional healing and bound to a man whose own wounds were still raw and bleeding. Outside the window, clouds gathered across the face of the moon, and in the distance, a coyote's howl echoed across the valley. It was a wild sound, lonely and fierce, that spoke of survival against impossible odds. As she listened to its fading notes, Nadia felt an unexpected kinship with the unseen creature. Like her, it was an outsider in a world that didn't always welcome its kind. But also like her, it endured adapting and persevering because giving up simply wasn't an option. When she was certain Noah was sleeping peacefully, she carefully extracted her hand from his grip and followed Jesse back downstairs. The house felt different somehow, less like a temporary shelter and more like a home where she was genuinely needed and wanted. "He's getting attached to you," Jesse observed as they settled back into the living room. "Is that a problem?" Jesse considered the question carefully. "It could be if circumstances force you to leave." "Do you want me to leave?" The question surprised them both. Nadia hadn't intended to ask it so directly, but now that the words were out, she found herself holding her breath for his answer. "No," Jesse said quietly. "I don't. Noah needs you, and honestly, so do I. This arrangement we've made, it's not what either of us planned for our lives, but it's working. You've brought something back to this house that I thought was gone forever." "What's that?" he said simply. "The feeling that tomorrow might be better than today." It was perhaps the most honest thing either of them had said since the day of their unconventional wedding, and it settled between them like a bridge across the careful distance they'd been maintaining. They were still strangers in many ways, still learning to navigate the complex dynamics of their forced partnership, but they were no longer merely fulfilling a legal obligation. They were building something together, fragile and undefined, but real nonetheless. The sound of hoofbeats in the yard interrupted the moment, and Jesse was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the rifle he kept beside the door. It was late for visitors, and given the recent tensions in town, unexpected callers could mean trouble. "Stay here," he told Nadia, then moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. "It's Frank," he said after a moment, recognizing his foreman's horse. Something must be wrong. Jesse opened the door as Frank approached the porch, and even in the dim light, Nadia could see that the older man was agitated. "Boss, we got problems," Frank said without preamble. "Someone cut the fence down by the south pasture, scattered about 40 head of cattle across creation." Jesse's jaw tightened. "When?" "Must have been tonight sometime after dark. Jim was checking the herd this morning and found the break. Looks deliberate clean cuts with wire cutters, not accidental damage." "Any sign of who did it?" Frank shook his head grimly. Whoever it was knew what they were doing. No tracks, no evidence left behind. But boss? He hesitated, glancing at Nadia, then back to Jesse. This wasn't random mischief. Someone sending a message. The implications hung heavy in the night air. Cutting fence was a serious crime in cattle country, but it was also a traditional way of expressing displeasure with a neighbor's actions. Combined with the rock thrown through Chen's store window and the mysterious rider who'd been watching them, it painted a picture of escalating harassment that made Nadia's stomach clench with worry. "How many men do we need to round up the scattered cattle?" Jesse asked, already shifting into the practical mode that had made him a successful rancher. "All of us. And it'll take most of tomorrow. Some of those steers wandered clear into Anderson's territory." "All right, get the men ready to ride at first light. I'll come with you." After Frank left to spread the word among the ranch hands, Jesse turned back to Nadia with an expression of deep concern. "I don't like leaving you and Noah alone tomorrow, especially not after this." "We'll be fine," Nadia assured him, though she felt far from confident. "The house is secure, and I know how to handle a rifle if necessary." It's not just about security. If whoever did this is escalating their harassment, Jesse trailed off, but the implication was clear. The next step after property damage might be violence against people. "Jesse," Nadia said quietly, "you can't let fear of what might happen prevent you from doing what needs to be done. The cattle have to be rounded up, and you need to be there to make sure it's done right. We'll take precautions, but we can't live our lives cowering in fear." Jesse studied her face in the lamplight, seeing the strength and determination that had first impressed him at the gallows. "All right," he said finally. "But you keep Noah close to the house, and if anything at all seems wrong, you take him and ride to the Anderson place. Understood?" Nadia nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Even as she tried to project confidence, she didn't entirely feel. They were facing an enemy who remained hidden, striking from the shadows with increasing boldness. Tomorrow would test whether their small family could weather the storm that seemed to be gathering around them. As they prepared for bed, each lost in their own thoughts about the challenges ahead, none of them noticed the figure watching from the ridge above the ranch house, or the way he turned his horse and melted back into the darkness like a specter, carrying news to those who waited in town for word of their plan's success. The dawn sky was still painted with streaks of rose and gold when Jesse kissed Noah's forehead and prepared to ride out with his men. The boy clung to his father's neck with unusual intensity, as if sensing that this departure carried more weight than the usual ranch business. "I'll be back before supper," Jesse promised gently, prying Noah's arms loose. "You take care of Miss Nadia while I'm gone, all right?" "Yes, Papa," Noah whispered, but his eyes remained wide with worry that seemed too old for his young face. Nadia stood on the porch watching as Jesse mounted his horse and gave final instructions to Frank and the other hands. The autumn morning was crisp and clear, the kind of day that should have filled her with hope and energy. Instead, a sense of foreboding settled in her chest like a cold stone. The cut fence had been more than simple vandalism. It was a declaration of war, and today would likely bring the first real battle. "Stay close to the house," Jesse called to her as he wheeled his horse toward the south pasture. "And remember what I said about the Andersons if anything goes wrong." She nodded and waved, maintaining her composure until the riders disappeared over the ridge. Only then did she allow herself to feel the full weight of her apprehension. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she and Noah would be truly alone, vulnerable to whatever forces were moving against them in the shadows. "Miss Nadia." Noah tugged at her skirt, drawing her attention back to the present. "Are you scared?" The question was asked with the direct honesty that characterized all of Noah's conversations, and Nadia realized that her own anxiety was probably written clearly across her face. She knelt down to his level and took his small hands in hers. "A little," she admitted. "But being scared doesn't mean we're helpless. It just means we need to be smart and careful." "What should we do?" Nadia considered their options. She could keep Noah inside, shuttered away from any possible danger, but that would only feed his fears and teach him that hiding was the answer to life's challenges. Instead, she chose a different approach. We're going to have a normal day, she decided. We'll do your lessons, tend the garden, maybe bake some bread for when your papa comes home. But we'll stay close to the house, and we'll keep our eyes open. Noah's face brightened at this plan, which sounded far more appealing than cowering indoors. Can we work on reading the plant book? Of course. They spent the morning at the kitchen table, poring over a botanical guide that Jessie had ordered from Denver for Noah's education. Nadia found the boy's enthusiasm for learning infectious, and for a while she was able to push aside her worries and focus on the simple pleasure of teaching. Noah proved to have an excellent memory for plant names and characteristics, and his questions showed a genuine understanding of the connections between traditional Apache medicine and the scientific classifications in the book. Look, he said excitedly, pointing to an illustration of purple coneflower. This is the same as what you called echinacea, isn't it? Exactly right. Different names for the same plant depending on who's doing the naming. Why do white people and Apache people have different names for everything? The innocent question touched on complexities that Nadia struggled to explain even to herself. Because different people see the world in different ways, she said carefully. Your people, white people, often name things based on what they look like or who discovered them first. My people name things based on their spirit, their purpose, their place in the great web of life. Which way is better? Maybe both ways are right. Maybe the world is big enough for different kinds of understanding. Noah absorbed this with the solemn concentration he brought to all philosophical discussions. Is that why some people don't like you, because you understand things differently? Partly yes. Some people are afraid of differences because they think it means their own way is wrong. But Papa isn't afraid of you. No, he isn't. Your Papa is brave enough to see that different doesn't mean dangerous. They were interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching the house at a gallop. Both Nadia and Noah rushed to the window, and she felt her heart sink when she recognized the rider. It was Billy Henderson, Martha Henderson's teenage son, and his face was flushed with excitement and malicious purpose. Stay inside, Nadia told Noah firmly. Whatever happens, you stay in this house. She stepped onto the porch as Billy brought his horse to a dramatic halt in the yard. At 17, he had all the cockiness of youth combined with the dangerous enthusiasm of someone who'd been told he was serving a righteous cause. Mrs. Blackwood, he called out, his voice carrying across the yard with deliberate loudness, I got a message for you from Bishop Harrington. I'm listening, Nadia replied calmly, though every instinct screamed at her to go back inside and bar the door. Billy straightened in his saddle, clearly relishing his role as messenger. The bishop says your time of corrupting decent folk is over. He says you got 24 hours to leave this territory or face the consequences of your evil ways. And what consequences might those be? Whatever it takes to cleanse this land of your heathen presence, Billy declared with the fervor of someone repeating words he'd been carefully taught. The Lord's justice won't be denied forever. Nadia felt anger rise in her chest, but she kept her voice level. Tell Bishop Harrington that I'm a legally married woman with every right to be here. If he has accusations to make, he can make them to Sheriff Sawyer. Billy's horse pranced nervously, sensing its rider's agitation. The sheriff ain't gonna help you when the righteous anger of God's people is unleashed. You mark my words, witch woman, tomorrow's sun ain't gonna set on you still being in this valley. Deliver your message, Billy Henderson. Now get off my property. Your property? Billy laughed harshly. This is Christian land and you ain't got no business. The crack of a rifle shot cut through his words, sending his horse rearing and Billy scrambling to keep his seat. Nadia had moved with lightning speed, drawing the Winchester that Jessie kept beside the front door and firing a warning shot into the air. I said get off my property. She repeated, her voice deadly calm as she worked the lever action to chamber another round. The next shot won't be a warning. Billy's face went pale as he struggled to control his frightened horse. You can't threaten me. I'm just delivering a message. And I'm delivering one right back. Tell your bishop that this ranch is protected by law and by force. Anyone who comes here looking for trouble will find more than they bargained for. For a moment, Billy looked like he might argue further, but the sight of the rifle in Nadia's steady hands convinced him otherwise. With a string of muttered curses that would have scandalized his mother, he wheeled his horse and galloped away, presumably to report back to his handlers in town. Nadia lowered the rifle but didn't set it aside as she watched Billy disappear over the ridge. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the surge of adrenaline that came from crossing a line she couldn't uncross. She'd just threatened a white teenager with a weapon, an act that could be twisted into justification for almost any retaliation. "Miss Nadia?" Noah's voice came from behind her, small and frightened. "What's going to happen?" She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his face pale, but his eyes bright with trust. Despite everything he'd witnessed, he still looked to her for comfort and protection. "I don't know, little one," she said honestly, "but whatever happens, we'll face it together." The rest of the morning passed in tense watchfulness. Nadia moved through the routine tasks of daily life, preparing lunch, checking the kitchen garden, mending a torn shirt, but her attention remained focused on the surrounding landscape. Every distant sound made her pause and listen. Every movement in her peripheral vision drew her immediate scrutiny. Noah seemed to understand the gravity of their situation without needing explanation. He stayed close to her side, speaking in whispers when he spoke at all, and helped with small tasks that kept his hands busy while his mind processed the morning's confrontation. Around noon, as they were eating a simple meal of bread and cheese, the sound of multiple horses approaching sent Nadia's heart racing. But when she looked out the window, relief flooded through her. It was Jesse and his men returning much earlier than expected. She ran outside to meet them with Noah close behind. Jesse's expression was grim as he dismounted, and she could see immediately that the day had brought more bad news. "We found the cattle," he said without preamble, "but that's not all we found." Frank and the other hands looked shaken, their faces bearing the expressions of men who'd seen something that disturbed them deeply. Jesse glanced at Noah, then back to Nadia. "Maybe we should talk inside," he suggested. Once Noah was settled with a book in the living room, Jesse led Nadia into the kitchen and closed the door. His face was pale beneath his tan, and she could see the effort it took for him to maintain his composure. "Someone's been busy while we were chasing cattle," he said grimly. "We found evidence of a camp about 2 miles south of here. Recent use, maybe as many as 6 or 8 men." "What kind of evidence?" "Campfire remains, horse droppings, food scraps, but that's not the worst of it." Jesse's jaw tightened. They'd set up some kind of target practice, had a scarecrow dressed in women's clothes shot full of holes. Nadia felt the blood drain from her face. The message was unmistakable and terrifying in its implications. "There's more," Jesse continued. "The scarecrow was wearing a patchy jewelry, turquoise and silver pieces that looked authentic. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure we understood what they were practicing for." The kitchen seemed to spin around Nadia as the full implication sank in. This wasn't just harassment or intimidation, it was preparation for murder. Someone was organizing a group of men to kill her, and they were treating it like a hunting expedition. "Jesse," she said quietly, "Billy Henderson came by this morning." Jesse's expression darkened further as she recounted the boy's visit and her response. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, staring out the window at the peaceful valley that suddenly seemed full of hidden threats. "You did the right thing," he said finally, "but you're right shooting at him, even as a warning, gives them ammunition to use against you. What do you think they'll do?" "I think Bishop Harrington has been planning this from the beginning," Jesse said grimly. "The cut fence the cattle scattered, it was all designed to get me and my men away from the ranch for the day. They probably planned to make their move while we were gone. But we're all here now. Surely they won't try anything with your men around." Jesse's expression suggested he wasn't so confident. "Frank, Jim, and the others are good men, but they're cowhands, not gunfighters. If Harrington's assembled a group of determined men—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Nadia understood the mathematics of the situation as clearly as he did. A few ranch hands against a group of armed zealots would be a massacre, not a fight. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. "I want you to take Noah and leave," Jesse said bluntly. "Tonight, under cover of darkness, ride to Denver, take the train east, start a new life somewhere far from here." The suggestion hit Nadia like a physical blow. After weeks of building something that felt like family, after watching Noah begin to heal and finding her own place in this strange new world, the thought of abandoning it all felt like a kind of death. "And leave you to face this alone. I can handle whatever comes, but I can't protect you and Noah if Harrington's really organized a vigilante group. The best thing you can do for all of us is to remove yourself from the equation." Nadia studied Jesse's face, seeing the pain behind his practical words. He was asking her to leave, not because he wanted her gone, but because he loved Noah enough to send away the woman who'd become a mother to him, and perhaps because he cared for her more than he was willing to admit. "No," she said quietly. "Nadia. No," she repeated more firmly. "I won't run again. I've spent 3 years running from place to place, never belonging anywhere, never having a real home. I won't abandon the first family I've ever had to save my own skin. This isn't about pride. It's not about pride, it's about what's right. You saved my life when you didn't have to. Noah has opened his heart to me when he could have remained closed off in his grief. I won't repay that trust by running at the first sign of real danger." Jesse was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. "I can't lose you too, Nadia. Noah can't lose another mother." The admission hung between them raw and honest, stripping away the careful formality they'd maintained since their marriage. For the first time, Jesse had acknowledged that their arrangement had become something more than legal convenience, that somewhere in the careful distance and measured kindness, real feelings had taken root. "Then we'll have to make sure that doesn't happen," Nadia said simply. Before Jesse could respond, the sound of approaching horses once again interrupted their conversation. But this time the sound was different, not the familiar rhythm of ranch business, but the organized cadence of a group moving with purpose. Jesse grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, his face going pale as he counted the riders approaching the house. 8 men, he said grimly. Harrington's in the lead. Nadia felt her stomach clench with fear. But alongside the terror was something else, a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. They wanted to destroy her family, to tear apart the fragile bonds that had grown between 3 wounded souls. She wouldn't let that happen without a fight. "Where's Noah?" she asked. "Still in the living room. Nadia, I want you to take him upstairs and—" "No." Her voice was steel. "We face this together as a family, all of us." Jesse started to argue, but the sound of Bishop Harrington's voice calling from the yard cut him short. "Jesse Blackwood, we've come to discuss the corruption that's taken root in your household." Jesse and Nadia exchanged a look, and she saw her own determination reflected in his eyes. Whatever happened next, they would meet it, standing together. They walked onto the porch, side by side, presenting a united front to the 8 mounted men who waited in their yard. Bishop Harrington sat at the center of the group, his pale eyes blazing with righteous fury. Flanking him were men Nadia recognized from town: the blacksmith, 2 shopkeepers, a farmer, and several others she couldn't identify. All were armed and all wore expressions of grim purpose. "Bishop," Jesse said calmly, "what brings you to my ranch?" "You know perfectly well what brings me here," Harrington replied, his voice carrying the theatrical projection he used for sermons. "The abomination you've brought into our Christian community cannot be allowed to continue. My wife is no abomination. She's a legally married woman with every right to be here." "Your wife," Harrington spat, "is a heathen witch who murdered Eleanor and corrupted your judgment with her evil practices. The good people of Willow Creek will not stand by while she spreads her poison among us." One of the other men, Tom Fletcher, the blacksmith, urged his horse forward slightly. "Jesse, we've known each other for years. You're a good man, but you've been bewitched by this creature. It's not too late to come to your senses." "The only thing that's bewitched me," Jesse replied steadily, "is watching my son smile again for the first time since his mother died. Nadia's brought nothing but healing to this house." "Healing?" Harrington's voice rose to near shriek. "She practices the dark arts. She communes with evil spirits. She corrupts innocent children with her heathen ways. She teaches him about plants and their uses," Jesse countered. "She sings him to sleep when nightmares wake him. She's shown him more kindness than he's received from anyone in this town since Eleanor's death." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but at that moment Noah appeared in the doorway behind them. His young voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Why are these men yelling at Miss Nadia?" Every eye turned to the boy who stood small and defiant in the doorway, his blue eyes bright with confusion and growing anger. Harrington's expression shifted when he saw Noah becoming almost predatory. "Come here, child," the bishop commanded, his voice suddenly gentle and coaxing. "Come away from that woman and her evil influence." "She's not evil," Noah said firmly. "She's kind and smart, and she makes Papa smile." "The child has been corrupted," Harrington announced to his followers. Polluted by prolonged exposure to heathen practices, he must be removed from this environment immediately. You'll remove no one from this property, Jesse said, his voice deadly quiet. My son stays with his family. That creature is not his family. Harrington's mask of gentleness dropped, revealing the fanatic beneath. She's a savage who's bewitched you both, but the Lord has shown me the way to cleanse this land of her presence. He raised his hand, and Nadia saw several of the other men reaching for their weapons. But before anyone could draw, Sheriff Tom Sawyer's voice cut across the yard. That's far enough, Bishop. Everyone turned to see the sheriff riding into the yard, flanked by two deputies Nadia didn't recognize. Tom Sawyer's weathered face was set in hard lines, and his hand rested casually on his gun belt. Sheriff, Harrington said, his voice regaining its smooth control. How fortunate that you're here to witness this intervention. We've come to remove a dangerous element from our community. What I see, Sawyer replied steadily, is an armed group threatening peaceful citizens on their own property. That's a crime, Bishop, regardless of your justifications. This woman is a murderer and a witch. This woman is legally married to Jesse Blackwood and under the protection of territorial law. Sawyer interrupted. If you have accusations to make them in court. If you have evidence to present it to a judge, but you will not take the law into your own hands in my jurisdiction. The tension in the yard was thick enough to cut with a knife. Harrington's followers looked uncertain, clearly not having expected law enforcement to interfere with their planned intervention. Several hands drifted away from weapons, but others seemed to be calculating their odds against the sheriff and his deputies. The law, Harrington said with icy contempt, is not always sufficient to deal with evil. Sometimes God's justice requires more direct action. God's justice, Sawyer replied, will be served in God's time and through proper channels. Until then, territorial law applies to everyone in this valley, including you. For a moment, Nadia thought Harrington might actually order his men to attack anyway. The fanatic light in his eyes suggested he was beyond rational calculation, driven by a certainty that brooked no opposition. But whatever internal struggle he fought, practicality won out. This is not over, he said quietly, his pale eyes fixed on Nadia with unmistakable hatred. Evil cannot hide behind legal technicalities forever. Maybe not, Sawyer agreed, but it'll hide behind them today. Now I suggest you and your men return to town before someone does something they'll regret. Harrington turned his horse without another word, and his followers reluctantly followed suit. As they rode away, Nadia felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, but she knew better than to believe the danger had passed. If anything, Harrington's public humiliation would only fuel his determination to destroy her. Sheriff Sawyer dismounted and approached the porch, removing his hat as he addressed Jesse and Nadia. Folks, I need to be honest with you. I can't keep this up indefinitely. Harrington's got influence and Denver connections that could make trouble for me if he decides to push hard enough. What are you saying, Tom? Jesse asked. I'm saying you need to be very careful. What happened here today was a standoff, not a victory. Harrington's not going to give up, and next time he might not be so concerned about legal niceties. So what do you suggest? Sawyer was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with his own conflicted loyalties. Honestly, I think Mrs. Blackwood should consider leaving the territory at least temporarily. Let things cool down, give Harrington time to find some other crusade to focus on. It was the same advice Jesse had given earlier, and Nadia's response was the same. I won't run, Sheriff. This is my home now, and I won't be driven away by threats and intimidation. Sawyer studied her face, seeing the same stubborn courage that had impressed him at the gallows weeks earlier. I figured you'd say that. In that case, I've got some advice. Don't go anywhere alone, especially not into town. Keep your weapons close and your guard up. And if you see any sign that Harrington's organizing another group... He trailed off, but the implication was clear. After the sheriff and his deputies left the small family gathered in the living room, all of them shaken by the day's events. Noah sat close to Nadia on the sofa, his small hand gripping hers as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. Miss Nadia, he said quietly, are you really going to stay? Yes, little one. I'm going to stay. Even though those men don't want you to? Especially because those men don't want me to. Sometimes when people try to frighten you into giving up something important, the only way to show them they're wrong is to refuse to be frightened. Noah absorbed this lesson with his usual gravity. Papa, are we going to be all right? Jesse looked at his son, then at Nadia, and she saw him make a decision that went beyond practical considerations. Yes, he said firmly. We're going to be all right. Because we're family and families protect each other. As evening fell over the Double B Ranch, they settled into a routine that felt almost normal despite the day's drama. Jesse checked the perimeter and secured the outbuildings while Nadia helped Noah with his evening prayers. But when the boy asked her to sing him to sleep, she chose not her traditional Apache lullabies, but a simple English song that Eleanor used to sing, a bridge between the past and present, between the mother who was gone and the woman who was learning to take her place. Later, as Jesse and Nadia sat by the fireplace, the events of the day settled around them like dust after a storm. The comfortable silence that had become their custom was colored now by shared danger and mutual dependence, by the recognition that their marriage of convenience had become something more precious and more fragile. Nadia, Jesse said quietly, I need you to know something. What I said earlier about not being able to lose you, I meant it. Somewhere along the way, this stopped being just about Noah needing a mother. She looked at him across the flickering firelight, seeing vulnerability in his expression that he rarely allowed himself to show. What are you saying? I'm saying that I care about you. Not just as Noah's stepmother, or as someone I'm legally obligated to protect, but as the woman who's brought light back into this house, the woman who's made me remember that life can be about more than just surviving from one day to the next. The confession hung between them honest and fragile, changing the nature of their relationship in ways that neither had fully anticipated. Nadia felt her own carefully maintained emotional distance beginning to crumble, revealing feelings she'd been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. Jesse, she said softly, I care about you too. About both of you. More than I expected to, more than I planned to. You've given me something I never thought I'd have, a place where I belong. People who see me as more than just my Apache blood or the accusations people have made against me. They sat in the warm glow of the fire. Two damaged souls who'd found unexpected healing in each other's company, while outside, the forces that sought to destroy their newfound happiness gathered strength in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new tests of their resolve to stand together against a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. But tonight, for these precious hours, they were simply a family, imperfect, unconventional, and bound together by something stronger than law or convenience. They were bound by choice, by love, and by the fierce determination to protect what they'd built from anyone who would seek to destroy it. In the distance, a coyote howled its wild song to the stars, and Nadia smiled at the sound. Like her, the coyote was a survivor, adapting and enduring in a world that offered few guarantees. Like her, it had found its pack, its place, its reason to keep fighting when fighting seemed futile. The battle for their family's future was far from over, but as she sat beside the man she'd grown to love and listened to the peaceful breathing of the child who'd claimed her heart, Nadia knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. And the next morning brought an unexpected visitor that changed everything. Nadia was hanging laundry behind the house when she heard Noah's excited voice calling from the front yard. Papa, Papa, there's a lady coming and she's riding like the wind. Jesse emerged from the barn, his face immediately tensing at the prospect of another unwelcome caller. But as the rider came into clear view, his expression shifted to one of surprise and concern. The woman approaching was Sarah Anderson, Jim Anderson's wife, and her usually composed demeanor had been replaced by obvious distress. Sarah brought her horse to a halt in front of the porch, her face flushed from hard riding and her graying hair escaping from its normally neat bun. At 45, she was known throughout the territory as a woman of unshakable calm and practical wisdom, which made her current agitation all the more alarming. Jesse, she said breathlessly as she dismounted, I need to speak with you and Nadia immediately. It's about Bishop Harrington. Nadia approached from the side of the house, still carrying the laundry basket, while Noah hung back uncertainly. Sarah's eyes found hers, and the older woman's expression held something Nadia hadn't expected to see from any white woman in the territory: sympathy and respect. Mrs. Anderson, Jesse said formally, what brings you out here in such a hurry? Information that couldn't wait, Sarah replied grimly. May we speak privately? Jesse glanced at Noah, then nodded toward the house. Noah, why don't you take that arithmetic book up to your room and work on the problems we marked yesterday? But Papa, now son. Once Noah had reluctantly disappeared inside, Sarah turned to face both Jesse and Nadia with an expression of grave concern. What I'm about to tell you comes from my husband's conversation with Tom Fletcher last night. Jim thought you should know what's being planned. What kind of plans? Nadia asked, though she suspected she already knew. Harrington's not finished with you, not by a long shot. Yesterday's confrontation just made him more determined. He's been holding meetings every night since then, working people up into a frenzy. Claims you've bewitched half the territory and that divine intervention is the only solution. Jesse's jaw tightened. What does that mean exactly? Sarah hesitated, clearly struggling with the implications of what she had to share. There's going to be another attempt to remove Nadia from the territory, but this time they're not going to be deterred by Sheriff Sawyer or legal technicalities. When? Nadia asked quietly. Tomorrow night. They're planning to come here after midnight when they think you'll be asleep and unprepared. Harrington's convinced them that it's God's work that they'll be blessed for cleansing the land of what he calls heathen corruption. The news settled over them like a dark cloud, confirming their worst fears about Harrington's intentions. But there was something in Sarah's manner that suggested she had more to share. There's something else, Sarah continued, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Something I heard from Martha Henderson when she came by yesterday evening. She was upset, crying, talking about how things had gone too far. What did she say? Jesse prompted. She said Harrington had convinced her husband and some of the other men that you... Sarah looked directly at Nadia. That you were planning to poison the town's water supply. Claims you've been gathering herbs for that purpose, that the plant collecting you've been doing with Noah was actually reconnaissance for some kind of attack. Nadia felt the blood drain from her face. That's completely false. The plants I've gathered are for healing, for teaching Noah about medicine. I would never... I know that, Sarah interrupted gently. Anyone with sense would know that. But fear makes people believe impossible things, and Harrington's very good at stoking fear. Jesse was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. If people believe Nadia's planning to poison the water supply, they'll see attacking this ranch as defending their own families. It won't matter what the law says. Exactly, Sarah agreed grimly. And there's more. Harrington's not just talking about driving Nadia away anymore. Martha let slip that some of the men are talking about making sure she can never threaten anyone again. The euphemism hung in the air like smoke, but its meaning was crystal clear. They weren't planning exile, they were planning murder. How many men? Nadia asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. Martha mentioned at least a dozen, maybe more, men from town and some of the smaller homesteads. They're convinced they're doing righteous work. Jesse ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing through their limited options. Can your husband spare any men to help us? Even 2 or 3 extra guns might make the difference. Sarah's expression grew even more troubled. Jim wants to help, Jesse, he truly does, but Harrington's made it clear that anyone who aids you will be considered equally guilty of harboring evil. Jim's got our 3 children to think about and our own ranch to protect. I understand, Jesse said quietly, though disappointment was clear in his voice. But, Sarah continued, Jim did send me with an offer. If Nadia's willing to leave tonight to slip away before tomorrow's attack, he'll provide horses and supplies to get her safely to Denver. From there, she could take the train east, start over somewhere far from here. It was the same solution that had been proposed repeatedly, and Nadia's response remained unchanged. I won't abandon my family. Even if staying means certain death, Sarah asked gently. Even then. Sarah studied Nadia's face for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. You know, when I first heard about Jesse marrying you, I thought he'd lost his mind with grief. Seemed like a desperate act that would only bring trouble. But watching you just now, seeing the way you talk about family... She paused, gathering her thoughts. I think I understand why he did it, and why he's willing to fight to keep you. The unexpected support from another woman, especially one whose opinion carried weight in the community, brought tears to Nadia's eyes. Thank you for saying that. I'm saying it because it's true. And because I want you to know that not everyone in this territory has lost their sense of right and wrong. Sarah straightened, decision made. Jim might not be able to spare men to fight, but he can do something else. Our ranch is 15 miles north of here, well away from the trouble. If you can get Noah out safely, we'll take him in until this is resolved." Jesse's face lit up with relief and gratitude. "Sarah, that would mean everything to us. The boy doesn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this madness. Get him to us before midnight tomorrow, and we'll keep him safe no matter what happens here." After Sarah left, Jesse and Nadia found themselves facing the most difficult conversation of their marriage. They sat at the kitchen table with cups of coffee growing cold between them, each lost in their own thoughts about the impossible choices ahead. "I want you to take Noah to the Andersons tonight," Jesse said finally, "and leave you here alone to face Harrington's mob. It's the only way to ensure Noah's safety, and if something happens to me, at least he'll have you to—" "Nothing's going to happen to you," Nadia interrupted fiercely. "We're going to face this together just like we agreed." "Nadia, be reasonable. A dozen armed men against the two of us—" "Against the three of us," she corrected. "Frank and the other hands won't abandon you when trouble comes." Jesse shook his head grimly. "I can't ask them to risk their lives for my personal battles. This isn't about the ranch or cattle rustling, it's about me and my choice to marry you. The men work for wages, not causes. You might be surprised by their loyalty. Even if they stayed, we'd still be outnumbered more than 2-1. Those aren't odds any sane person would take." Nadia reached across the table and took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses and scars that spoke of a lifetime of hard work and harder choices. "Jesse, listen to me. 3 weeks ago, I was ready to die rather than submit to injustice. You gave me a second chance at life, at happiness, at belonging somewhere. I won't throw that away by running when things get difficult." "This isn't difficult. It's suicidal." "Maybe, but I'd rather die fighting for something I believe in than live knowing I abandoned the people I love when they needed me most." Jesse was quiet for a long moment, studying their joined hands. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I love you too, you know. Somehow impossibly, I fell in love with the woman who was supposed to be just a convenient solution to Noah's need for a mother." The words hung between them, honest and raw, changing everything and nothing at the same time. They'd been dancing around these feelings for weeks, both afraid to acknowledge what was growing between them. Now, with potential death looming over them, the truth could no longer be denied or delayed. "I love you too," Nadia whispered. "Both of you, more than I ever thought possible." They sat in the warm kitchen, holding hands across the table, while outside the autumn wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance their enemies made final preparations for what they believed would be a righteous cleansing. For a few precious moments, the world contracted to just the two of them, and the love they'd found in the most unlikely circumstances. The moment was broken by Noah's voice calling from the living room. "Papa, Miss Nadia, come quick." They rushed into the front room to find Noah standing at the window, his face pressed against the glass. In the distance, a column of smoke was rising from the direction of town. "What is it?" Noah asked, his voice small with worry. Jesse grabbed his spyglass from the mantelpiece and trained it on the smoke. His expression grew dark as he focused the lens. "It's Chen's store," he said grimly. "Looks like it's burning." Nadia felt sick to her stomach. The Chinese merchant had been targeted once already for showing kindness to her family. Now it appeared that kindness had cost him everything. "We have to help," she said, starting toward the door. "No," Jesse's voice was sharp. "This could be a trap, a way to draw us away from the ranch so they can attack when we're not prepared. But if Mr. Chen needs help, if we ride into town now, we'll be walking straight into their hands. Chen's a smart man. He'll have ways to protect himself and his family. But if we're caught in town without backup—" Jesse didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Their enemies might be hoping for exactly this kind of humanitarian response, counting on their decency to override their caution. They spent the rest of the day in a state of tense preparation. Jesse cleaned and loaded every weapon on the ranch while Nadia secured the house-moving furniture to create defensive positions and ensuring they had adequate supplies of food and water in case of a siege. Noah, sensing the gravity of the situation, helped where he could without asking too many questions. As evening approached, Frank and the other ranch hands returned from their work in the far pastures. Jesse gathered them in the barn to explain the situation, giving each man the option to leave before trouble arrived. To Nadia's surprise and gratitude, not one of them chose to go. "Hell, boss," Frank said with a grim smile. "I've been working this ranch for 8 years. Anyone wants to burn it down, they'll have to go through me first." The other hands voiced similar sentiments, their loyalty to Jesse extending to protection of his family, regardless of the circumstances that had created it. Nadia felt a surge of warmth for these rough, practical men who'd chosen to stand with them despite the odds. As full darkness fell, Jesse made the difficult decision to send Noah to the Anderson ranch. The boy protested tearfully, begging to stay and help defend his home, but Jesse remained firm. "This is how you help," he told his son gently. "By staying safe so that whatever happens here, the Blackwood name continues. Can you do that for me?" Noah nodded reluctantly. His young face set in lines that made him look far older than his 8 years. "But you have to promise to come get me when it's over." "I promise," Jesse said, hoping it was a vow he'd be able to keep. Frank volunteered to escort Noah to the Anderson place, taking a route that would avoid the main roads and any potential patrols. As they prepared to leave, Noah threw his arms around Nadia's waist and held on tight. "I love you, Miss Nadia," he whispered against her shoulder. "You're the best mama I could have asked for." The words broke something inside her chest, and she had to fight back tears as she held him close. "I love you too, little one. Be brave for us, all right?" After Noah and Frank departed, an eerie quiet settled over the ranch. Jesse had positioned his remaining men at strategic points around the property with orders to watch for approaching riders and signal at the first sign of trouble. The waiting was almost harder than the prospect of fighting, each minute stretching endlessly as they strained their ears for sounds that might herald the attack. Around 10 o'clock, a rider approached under a white flag. It was Tom Fletcher, the blacksmith, his face pale in the moonlight, as he brought his horse to a halt just outside rifle range. "Jesse," he called out, "I've come to talk." Jesse emerged from the house with his rifle Nadia close behind him, despite his attempts to keep her inside. "Say your piece, Tom." "There's still time to end this peacefully," Fletcher shouted. "Send the woman out and no one else has to get hurt. The woman has a name," Jesse replied coldly. "She's my wife and she stays where she belongs." "Damn it, Jesse, don't be a fool. There's near 20 men coming and they're not in a mood for negotiation. Save yourself and your boy." "My boy's safe and my wife stays with me. If Harrington wants her, he'll have to come through me to get her." Fletcher was quiet for a moment, then his voice carried a note of genuine sadness. "I'm sorry it's come to this, Jesse. You're a good man, but you've made the wrong choice. The only wrong choice would be abandoning someone I love to save my own skin." Fletcher wheeled his horse and rode back toward town, carrying Jesse's defiant message to the waiting mob. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the night, Nadia moved closer to Jesse and took his hand. "Last chance to change your mind," she said quietly. "I could still slip away, disappear into the hills. You'd be safe then. We've been through this. I'm not letting you face this alone. Even if it means dying for someone you've known less than a month." Jesse turned to face her fully, his eyes reflecting the pale moonlight. "Especially then. Some things are worth dying for, Nadia. Love is one of them. Family is another. The principle that no one should be murdered for being different is a third." "When did you become such a philosopher?" "When I realized that losing you would hurt worse than anything else I could imagine." They stood together in the shadow of the house, holding hands and watching the horizon for signs of their approaching enemies. The night was clear and cold, with stars scattered across the sky like scattered diamonds. It was beautiful enough to break your heart, the kind of night that made you grateful to be alive even in the face of mortal danger. Around 11:30, the dogs started barking. The sound was different from their usual alerts, more urgent, more sustained, carrying a note of genuine alarm that raised the hair on the back of Nadia's neck. "They're coming," Jesse said quietly, raising his rifle. In the distance, the sound of many horses moving at a deliberate pace began to reach them. No attempt at stealth now. Harrington's mob was approaching, openly confident in their numbers and their cause. As they drew closer, Nadia could make out individual voices, angry and excited, feeding off each other's energy like wolves working themselves up for a hunt. The attack, when it came, was both more and less than they had expected. Bishop Harrington had indeed assembled nearly 20 men, but they lacked military discipline or tactical knowledge. Their approach was noisy and disorganized, more like an angry crowd than a coordinated assault force. Jesse's men were ready for them. The first shots came from the ranch hands positioned in the barn and outbuildings, carefully aimed rounds that sent several attackers tumbling from their horses and caused the others to scatter for cover. The element of surprise which Harrington had been counting on was lost in the first 30 seconds of fighting. But numbers told, and the attackers had them. For every shot fired by Jesse's defenders, 3 or 4 came back in response. The house began taking hits bullets, splintering wood and shattering windows, forcing Jesse and Nadia to take cover behind overturned furniture. "The barn's on fire!" Nadia shouted over the gunfire, pointing toward the orange glow that had begun to illuminate the night. Jesse cursed under his breath. Harrington's men had brought torches, planning to burn them out if direct assault failed. The strategy was brutally effective. Fire was the one enemy that couldn't be fought with bullets. "We need to get to the root cellar," Jesse said, grabbing Nadia's hand. "If the house catches fire, it's our only protection." They were halfway across the kitchen when a new sound joined the chaos outside, the thunder of approaching horses. But these were coming from the north, not from town. Jesse paused, listening intently. Then his face broke into a grin of pure relief. "That's cavalry horns," he said wonderingly. "Someone sent for the army." Through the broken windows, they could see Harrington's men turning in confusion as a troop of blue-uniformed soldiers swept into the yard. The mob, brave enough when facing isolated civilians, scattered like leaves before the wind when confronted with professional military force. The shooting stopped as abruptly as it had begun, replaced by shouted orders and the sounds of men surrendering or fleeing into the night. Jesse and Nadia emerged from the house, cautiously, hardly daring to believe that salvation had arrived so unexpectedly. Captain William Morrison, a weathered man in his 50s with graying hair and steel-gray eyes, dismounted near the porch and approached them with a crisp salute. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm Captain Morrison, Fort Collins. We received word that there was trouble here." "Who sent word?" Jesse asked, still stunned by the timing of their rescue. "Sheriff Sawyer rode to the fort yesterday morning, said there was about to be vigilante action against civilians and that federal intervention might be necessary to prevent a massacre." Nadia felt a surge of gratitude toward the sheriff, who'd clearly been working behind the scenes to protect them, even when he couldn't do so openly. Tom Sawyer had risked his own position to ensure their safety, and she would never forget that kindness. "What about Harrington and his men?" Jesse asked. "Most of them scattered when they saw us coming, but we've got Bishop Harrington and 6 others in custody. They'll be transported to Denver to face federal charges for conspiracy and attempted murder." The words were music to Nadia's ears. For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, she felt truly safe, protected not just by Jesse's love, but by the full weight of law and justice. Captain Morrison's expression grew more serious. "I have to tell you, though, this isn't over. Harrington may be in custody, but the attitudes that led to tonight's attack are still out there. You'll need to be careful." "We understand," Jesse replied, "but we're not running. This is our home." "Good for you. The territory needs more people willing to stand up for what's right, regardless of the color of someone's skin or the god they pray to." As dawn broke over the Double B Ranch, Frank returned with Noah, who launched himself into Nadia's arms with desperate relief. The boy had spent the night terrified that he'd lost another parent, and his tears of joy at finding them safe and whole were almost more than she could bear. The immediate crisis was over, but the work of rebuilding, both physical and emotional, lay ahead. The barn would need to be reconstructed. Fences repaired, trusts slowly rebuilt with their neighbors. But as Nadia stood on the porch, holding Noah while Jesse surveyed the damage to their property, she felt something she'd never experienced before: complete confidence in the future. They'd faced the worst that hatred and fear could throw at them, and they'd survived. More than that, they'd proven that love and courage could triumph over prejudice and violence. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight, but they would face them together as a family, and that made all the difference. Sheriff Sawyer arrived later that morning to take statements and help with the cleanup. His expression was carefully neutral, but when he spoke privately with Jesse and Nadia, his relief was obvious. "I wasn't sure the cavalry would arrive in time," he admitted. "Harrington was more organized than I'd expected, and he'd worked people up into a real frenzy. If you'd tried to face that mob alone..." "We wouldn't have been alone," Jesse pointed out. "My men stood with us." "Good men are rare," Sawyer agreed. "Hang on to them." As the sheriff prepared to leave, he had one final piece of news. "You might be interested to know that Chen's store wasn't burned by Harrington's people. Old Chen set that fire himself as a signal he'd arranged with the fort commander to send up smoke if Harrington's mob actually moved against you. Smart man, that Chinese fellow." The revelation that Chen had risked his own property to help save their lives left Nadia speechless with gratitude. In a territory where many saw her as an outsider and a threat, she'd found unexpected allies willing to sacrifice for her safety. As the sun climbed higher over the valley, bringing warmth to the crisp autumn air, the Blackwood family began the process of reclaiming their normal life. Noah helped gather the scattered chickens that had fled during the fighting, his young voice bright with chatter about his adventure at the Anderson Ranch. Jesse worked with his hands to assess the damage and plan repairs, his face lighter than it had been in weeks. And Nadia found herself standing in the garden behind the house, looking out over the vast landscape that had become her home. The mountains in the distance stood eternal and unchanging witnesses to human struggles that seemed both desperately important and ultimately small in the grand scheme of creation. She was still standing there when Jesse found her, slipping his arms around her waist from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Thinking about anything in particular?" he asked. "About how strange life is. 3 weeks ago I was waiting to die. Now I'm planning what to plant in this garden come spring. Any regrets? About marrying you, about staying to fight? About choosing this life over safety?" She leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her spine. "Not a single one. Even though it almost got us killed. Especially because of that. Anyone can live safely by avoiding all risk, all commitment, all love. But living like that isn't really living at all. It's just surviving. And I'm tired of just surviving." Jesse was quiet for a moment, absorbing her words. "So what do you want instead?" "I want to live, really live. I want to watch Noah grow up into the fine man he's going to become. I want to learn every inch of this ranch and make it truly ours. I want to have children of our own if God wills it. I want to grow old with you and die in the bed we share, surrounded by grandchildren who'll never know what it's like to be hated for the color of their skin or the traditions of their people." That's a beautiful dream. It's more than a dream now. It's a plan. As they stood together in the garden, watching their son play with the surviving chickens, while their ranch hands worked to repair the damage from the night's violence, they could almost see the future stretching out before them. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever was. There would be setbacks and sorrows, losses and disappointments. But there would also be joy and growth, love and laughter, the deep satisfaction that came from building something lasting in a world that often seemed determined to tear everything down. The battle for their right to exist as a family was over, but the work of living that life was just beginning. And as Nadia felt Jesse's arms tighten around her and heard Noah's delighted laughter echoing across their land, she knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them with courage, with love, and with the unshakable conviction that some things were worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. The first few weeks after the attack passed in a blur of reconstruction and cautious optimism. The burned barn rose from its ashes stronger and larger than before, while the bullet holes in the house walls were patched and painted over, until only those who'd lived through that terrible night could spot where the scars had been. But the most significant changes weren't visible to the casual observer. They lived in the hearts and minds of the Blackwood family, who had discovered that surviving a crisis together had transformed their marriage of convenience into something deeper and more unshakable than either Jesse or Nadia had dared to hope. Noah seemed to have grown years older in the space of a single night. The boy who had once asked tentative questions about whether Nadia would stay had become fiercely protective of his unconventional family, quick to challenge anyone who spoke against his stepmother, and proud to introduce her as such to the few visitors who came to the ranch. His nightmares, which had plagued him since Eleanor's death, gradually faded, replaced by dreams of the future he was helping to build on the Double B. "Miss Nadia," he said one morning as they worked together in the kitchen garden, pulling up the last of the autumn vegetables before the first hard freeze. "When I'm grown up, will you teach my children about the healing plants too?" The question caught her off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it represented such complete acceptance of their permanence as a family. "If you want me to, yes, but that's still many years away." "I know, but I want to make sure they know both kinds of medicine, the white doctor kind and the Apache kind. That way they'll be able to help more people." Nadia smiled at his earnest planning. "That's a wonderful idea. Maybe they'll find ways to combine the knowledge, make new discoveries that help everyone. Do you think there will still be people who don't like them for having Apache blood? The innocence of the question, asked with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who'd been forced to confront adult prejudices far too early, made Nadia's heart ache. Perhaps some people will still be afraid of differences. But I think the world is changing, Noah. Slowly, but changing nonetheless. Your children will grow up in a better time than this one. How can you be so sure? Because good people like your father, like the Andersons, like Sheriff Sawyer, they're teaching their children to be better than the generation before them. And those children will teach their children the same lesson. Each generation learns to see a little more clearly, to fear a little less. Noah considered this with his characteristic gravity, then nodded as if filing the information away for future reference. I hope you're right. I hope so too, little one. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a wagon approaching from town, driven by someone whose visits had become increasingly frequent since the night of the attack. Doc Morrison climbed down from his buckboard with the careful movements of a man whose arthritis complained about the changing weather, but his face was bright with the enthusiasm that had marked his relationship with the Blackwood family since he'd first met Nadia. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackwood," he called out, touching the brim of his hat. "I've brought those medical journals I promised, and something else I think you'll find interesting." Dr. Morrison had become an unexpected ally in the weeks following Harrington's arrest. The territory's only physician had been impressed by Nadia's knowledge of traditional medicine and had begun a correspondence with colleagues in Denver about the potential for combining native healing practices with modern medical techniques. His support had done more to legitimize Nadia's place in the community than any legal document could have achieved. "What have you brought us today?" Nadia asked, wiping her hands on her apron as she approached the wagon. "Letters," Doc Morrison replied with barely contained excitement. "Letters from the Medical College in Denver, from the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, even one from a professor at Harvard who's studying indigenous healing practices. They want to hear about your work, Mrs. Blackwood. They want to learn from you." The idea seemed impossible. Just 2 months ago, she'd been condemned as a witch whose knowledge was considered dangerous superstition. Now, educated men hundreds of miles away wanted to study her healing methods and incorporate them into formal medical practice. "They want to learn from me," she repeated, hardly daring to believe it. "Indeed they do. Professor Whitney at Harvard has been collecting information about tribal medicine for years, but he's never had access to someone with your depth of knowledge who could also explain the practices in terms that university-trained doctors could understand." Doc Morrison's eyes sparkled with possibility. "They're even talking about inviting you to present your findings at a medical conference next spring." Jesse emerged from the barn in time to hear this remarkable news, his face breaking into a grin that transformed his usually serious features. "A medical conference? My wife, the renowned scholar—" "It's not that remarkable," Nadia protested, though her cheeks flushed with pleased embarrassment. "I'm just sharing what my grandmother taught me." "Don't underestimate the value of that knowledge," Doc Morrison said seriously. "Western medicine has made great strides in surgery and anatomy, but we're still struggling with basic issues like pain management and infection control. Your willow bark preparations are more effective than anything we can purchase from pharmaceutical companies, and your methods for treating infected wounds have saved lives that conventional treatment would have lost." The conversation continued over dinner with Doc Morrison, describing the growing interest in traditional healing methods among progressive physicians. As the evening wore on, Nadia found herself caught between excitement and apprehension. The attention was flattering, but it also meant exposure to a wider world that might not be as accepting as the small circle of allies they'd found in Wyoming territory. "Are you worried about it?" Jesse asked later that night as they prepared for bed. It had taken weeks for them to acknowledge that their marriage had evolved beyond its original practical arrangement, but now they shared the master bedroom with the comfortable intimacy of a couple who'd chosen each other freely. "A little," Nadia admitted. "What if they expect more than I can give? What if my knowledge isn't as valuable as Doc Morrison thinks? Then they'll learn something anyway, and you'll learn something from them. But I suspect you're underestimating yourself." Jessie sat on the edge of the bed, watching as she brushed her long hair in front of the mirror. "You've already changed how people in this territory think about medicine. Mrs. Chen came by last week specifically to thank you for the salve you made for her son's burns, said it worked better than anything the doc had tried. That was just calendula and honey basic healing techniques. Basic to you, miraculous to her. Don't discount the impact you're having just because it seems simple to you. Their conversation was interrupted by Noah's voice calling softly from his room down the hall. These late-night interruptions had become less frequent, but hadn't entirely disappeared, and both adults responded immediately. They found Noah sitting up in bed, not crying or distressed, but wide awake with the kind of energy that suggested sleep was unlikely to return soon. "What's troubling you, son?" Jesse asked, settling on the edge of the boy's bed. "I was thinking about what Doc Morrison said about Miss Nadia going to talk to other doctors. Does that mean she'll have to go away?" The question revealed the heart of Noah's concern, and Nadia felt her chest tighten with empathy. This child had already lost one mother. The possibility of losing another, even temporarily, would naturally frighten him. "If I do go to any conferences," she said gently, "it would only be for a few days, and only if you and your father could come with me. We're a family, Noah. We travel together." "Could we really come too?" Noah's eyes brightened with excitement at the prospect of adventure. "If such a trip happens, yes, but it's all very uncertain right now. These doctors might decide my knowledge isn't as interesting as they think." "It is interesting," Noah said with the absolute certainty of childhood. "You know things other people don't know, and you use them to help people feel better. That's the most interesting thing in the world." As winter settled over the Double B ranch, life developed a rhythm that felt both peaceful and purposeful. The short days were filled with the usual tasks of maintaining livestock and property, but the long evenings became opportunities for learning and growth that none of them had anticipated when they'd first come together as a family. Nadia had begun documenting her knowledge systematically, writing down recipes and techniques that had previously existed only in memory and oral tradition. Jesse, whose education had been limited to practical matters of ranching and business, found himself fascinated by the intersection of science and tradition that his wife represented. Noah absorbed everything like a sponge, asking questions that often led to discussions lasting well into the night. "Why do some plants work for healing and others don't?" he asked one evening as they sat around the kitchen table, Nadia writing in her journal while Jesse worked on ranch accounts and Noah practiced his letters. "Everything in nature has properties," Nadia explained, setting down her pen to give the question proper attention. "Some plants contain substances that reduce pain or fight infection. Others might be poisonous or have no effect at all. Learning which is which takes careful observation and testing over many generations." "How did your grandmother know which plants to test?" "Through trial and error, mostly. She learned from her grandmother, who learned from hers going back countless generations. Each woman added to the knowledge refined, it made it more precise." Jesse looked up from his ledger. "It's like breeding cattle in a way. You observe the results, keep what works, discard what doesn't, and gradually improve the outcome." "Exactly," Nadia agreed. "Except instead of breeding for stronger cattle, we were breeding for more effective medicines." Noah's next question caught them both off guard. "Will you teach me to be a medicine person like you?" The request was asked with such earnest hope that Nadia felt tears spring to her eyes. "If that's truly what you want, yes, but it's not something you decide lightly, Noah. It means dedicating your life to helping others, sometimes at great personal cost. Like when you stayed to help Mama, even though you knew people might blame you." The simple statement, delivered with a child's clarity, hit both adults like a physical blow. Jesse's hand tightened on his pen, and Nadia had to take a moment to compose herself before responding. "Yes, like that. Sometimes helping people means accepting risks or sacrifices that others wouldn't be willing to make." "Oh, I think I'd like that," Noah said seriously. "Being someone who helps people, I mean, even if it's hard sometimes." The conversation marked a turning point in Noah's development, the moment when he began to see his future in terms of service to others, rather than simply personal achievement. Over the following weeks, his questions became more focused, his attention to Nadia's lessons more intense. He began to display an intuitive understanding of plant properties that impressed even Doc Morrison during his weekly visits. "That boy has real aptitude," the doctor observed one afternoon after watching Noah correctly identify several medicinal plants by scent alone. "With proper training, he could become quite accomplished." "He's certainly eager to learn," Nadia agreed. "Sometimes I think he absorbs information faster than I can teach it." "Would you consider sending him east for formal medical training when he's older?" "There are schools that would value his unique perspective." The suggestion opened up possibilities that none of them had considered. Noah could have opportunities that combined the best of both worlds: traditional healing knowledge, and modern medical education. He could become a bridge between cultures, helping to heal the divisions that had caused so much pain and conflict. That's years away yet, Jesse pointed out. He's barely 9 years old. Of course, but it's never too early to plan for exceptional potential. As spring approached, bringing news of Bishop Harrington's trial and convictions in Denver, the territory began to feel like a genuinely safe place for the first time since Nadia's arrival. The bishop had been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for conspiracy and incitement to violence, and several of his followers had received shorter sentences or substantial fines. More importantly, his removal had created space for more moderate voices to influence community opinion. The first real test of this changing atmosphere came when Nadia was asked to treat young Timothy Fletcher, the blacksmith's son, who'd been present at her near execution months earlier. The boy had been kicked by a horse and suffered a compound fracture that Doc Morrison feared might become infected despite his best efforts. "Tom Fletcher's asking for you specifically," the doctor reported when he came to request Nadia's help. "Says he's heard about your success with wound treatment and wants the best possible care for his son." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The same man who'd participated in Harrington's mob was now seeking help from the woman he'd once wanted to see hanged. But Nadia didn't hesitate. "Of course I'll help. When do we leave?" The treatment of Timothy Fletcher's injury became a turning point in community relations. Nadia spent 3 days in town, staying in the Fletcher's home while she treated the boy's wound with traditional remedies that promoted healing and prevented infection. Her success was dramatic and undeniable. The boy recovered completely, with no signs of the complications that Doc Morrison had feared. More importantly, her presence in town during those 3 days allowed people to see her as she truly was a skilled healer, dedicated to helping anyone who needed care, regardless of their past treatment of her. By the time she returned to the ranch, the atmosphere in Willow Creek had shifted perceptibly in her favor. "Mrs. Blackwood." Martha Henderson approached her on the final day, her face flushed with embarrassment, but her voice steady with determination. "I wanted to apologize for my behavior during that terrible time. I was frightened and foolish, and I let fear overcome my better judgment." The apology, offered publicly in front of Chen's rebuilt general store, was witnessed by several other townspeople who had similar regrets about their past actions. Nadia's gracious acceptance of these apologies did more to heal community divisions than any formal reconciliation process could have achieved. "Fear makes people do things they later regret," she replied gently. "What matters is that we learn from our mistakes and choose to do better." The spring also brought the long-awaited invitation to present her research at a medical conference in Denver. The letter, written on official letterhead from the Colorado Medical Society, was addressed to Dr. Nadia Blackwood and requested her presence as a featured speaker on traditional healing practices and their applications in modern medicine. "Dr. Blackwood," Jesse read with obvious pride and amusement. "I like the sound of that." "I'm not really a doctor," Nadia protested, though she was clearly pleased by the recognition. "You heal people using knowledge gained through years of study and practice. That makes you a doctor in every way that matters." The family's excitement about the conference was tempered by practical concerns about leaving the ranch for an extended period. Spring was calving season, a critical time that required constant attention from Jesse and his hands. But Frank, ever resourceful, proposed a solution. "Take Jim and Bob with you for protection," he suggested, referring to 2 of the younger hands who'd proven themselves during the attack. "The rest of us can handle things here for a week or so, especially if the Andersons can lend a hand if needed." The trip to Denver became a family adventure that exceeded all of Noah's expectations and gave Nadia her first taste of the wider recognition her work was beginning to receive. The conference was held in the elegant Brown Palace Hotel, where delegates from across the Western Territories gathered to share the latest developments in medical practice. Nadia's presentation, delivered to an audience of more than 200 physicians, was received with enthusiasm that bordered on amazement. Her detailed explanation of traditional wound care, pain management, and infection prevention opened eyes to possibilities that most of the attendees had never considered. Mrs. Blackwood, Dr. Elizabeth Garrett, one of the few female physicians present, approached her after the presentation. "Your work represents exactly the kind of medical integration that our profession desperately needs. Have you considered documenting your knowledge in a formal textbook?" The suggestion was both thrilling and daunting. A textbook would preserve her grandmother's knowledge for future generations while legitimizing traditional healing practices in academic circles. But it would also be an enormous undertaking that would require resources and connections she wasn't sure she possessed. "I've been keeping detailed notes," Nadia replied carefully, "but organizing them into a formal publication seems overwhelming." "I'd be happy to collaborate with you," Dr. Garrett offered. "I have contacts with several medical publishers who would be very interested in such a project. Together we could create something truly groundbreaking." The conversation continued over dinner, where Jessie and Noah listened with growing excitement as the two women outlined possibilities for preserving and sharing Nadia's knowledge. By the end of the evening, the framework for what would become Traditional Medicine of the American West, a comprehensive guide, had been established. The return journey to Wyoming Territory was filled with planning and dreaming about the future. Noah peppered them with questions about medical school and publishing, while Jessie quietly calculated the financial implications of Nadia's growing reputation. The speaking fees from the conference had been substantial enough to fund significant improvements to the ranch and Noah's education. "I never imagined," Nadia said as they watched the familiar landscape of home come into view, "that something I learned at my grandmother's knee would become the foundation for a career that reaches so far beyond our valley." "Your grandmother probably did imagine it," Jessie replied thoughtfully. "When she taught you those healing songs and plant remedies, she was investing in a future she might not have been able to see clearly, but one she believed in nonetheless." "What do you mean?" "She was preserving knowledge that she knew was valuable, even if the world wasn't ready to appreciate it yet. By teaching you, she was making sure that when the world did become ready, the knowledge would still exist." The insight was profound and moving, connecting Nadia's current success to the wisdom and foresight of ancestors she'd never fully appreciated. Her grandmother hadn't just been teaching traditional medicine, she'd been ensuring cultural survival and eventual recognition. As summer settled over, the Double B ranch life took on a pace that balanced the demands of their growing public profile with the simple pleasures of family life. Nadia worked on her book in the early morning hours before the day's heat made writing uncomfortable, while Noah helped Jessie with ranch work and continued his education in both traditional and academic subjects. The publication project progressed steadily, with Dr. Garrett proving to be an ideal collaborator who understood both the scientific and cultural implications of their work. Correspondence flowed between Denver and the ranch as they refined chapters and debated approaches to complex topics. "This section on pain management is particularly strong," Dr. Garrett wrote in one letter. "Your explanation of why willow bark is superior to laudanum for certain conditions challenges assumptions that most physicians have never questioned. I believe this book will revolutionize how we approach patient care." The praise was gratifying, but even more meaningful was the recognition that their work might prevent other families from experiencing the kind of loss and grief that had brought the Blackwoods together. If traditional medicine could be integrated into standard practice, patients would have access to treatments that were both more effective and less dangerous than many conventional approaches. The first real test of this integration came when a cholera outbreak struck a mining camp 50 miles east of Willow Creek. Doc Morrison, overwhelmed by the number of cases and running low on conventional treatments, sent an urgent request for Nadia's assistance. "I hate to ask you to risk exposure," he wrote, "but traditional remedies might be our only hope of containing this outbreak before it spreads to the larger population centers." Jessie's first instinct was protective. "Cholera is deadly, Nadia. You'd be putting yourself at enormous risk." "People are dying," she replied simply. "If I have knowledge that could save lives, how can I not share it? What about Noah? What about our family? Our family will survive because we love each other and we've built something strong. But those miners have families too, families who are watching them die because conventional medicine doesn't have effective treatments for cholera." The argument continued for most of a day, but Jessie's objections were ultimately overruled by his recognition that Nadia was right. Her knowledge was too valuable to withhold from those who desperately needed it, regardless of the personal risk involved. The cholera outbreak became another turning point in Nadia's reputation. Working alongside Doc Morrison and 2 other physicians, she implemented traditional treatments that dramatically reduced the mortality rate among affected miners. Her success was so striking that word of it reached medical communities as far away as Chicago and Boston. "The results speak for themselves," wrote Dr. Samuel Hoffman, a prominent physician from Boston who had heard about Nadia's work through professional networks. A 30% reduction in cholera mortality using traditional plant-based treatments represents a breakthrough that could save thousands of lives if implemented on a larger scale. The recognition brought new opportunities and new responsibilities. Medical schools began requesting guest lectures. Publishers competed for the rights to her book, and government health officials sought her input on public health policies affecting Native American communities. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life," Nadia confessed to Jesse one evening as they sat on the porch watching Noah play with a new litter of puppies. "A year ago, I was a condemned woman with no future. Now I'm being asked to advise the territorial governor on health policy." "You're living the life you were meant to live," Jesse replied. "It just took the right circumstances to reveal it, and the right family to support it. We all support each other. That's what families do." As autumn returned to Wyoming territory, bringing with it the anniversary of Nadia's arrival at the Double B Ranch, the three of them gathered for a quiet celebration of how far they'd come. The evening meal was simple venison. Jesse had hunted vegetables from Nadia's expanded garden bread that Noah had helped bake, but the conversation was rich with memories and plans for the future. "Do you remember," Noah asked, "when you first came here and I asked if you were really a witch?" "I remember." Nadia laughed. "What do you think now?" "I think you're magical," the boy said seriously. "But not the scary kind of magic, the kind that makes people better and brings families together." "That's the best kind of magic there is," Jesse agreed, reaching across the table to take Nadia's hand. As they cleared the dishes and prepared for another evening of reading and quiet conversation, Nadia reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. The terrified woman who had stood on the gallows a year ago bore little resemblance to the confident healer and respected scholar she had become. But the transformation hadn't been accomplished through magic. It had been achieved through love, courage, and the unwavering belief that people could change, grow, and heal when given the opportunity. Outside their warm kitchen, the Wyoming wind sang its eternal song across the valley, carrying with it the promise of new challenges and new opportunities. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, bound by love and strengthened by the knowledge that some things, family justice, the healing power of compassion, were worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. In the distance, a coyote's howl echoed across the star-filled sky, wild and free and enduring. Nadia smiled at the sound, recognizing in it the same spirit that had carried her through the darkest moments of her life and into the bright promise of tomorrow. Like the coyote, she had survived by adapting, by finding her pack, by refusing to surrender in the face of impossible odds. The gallows at Willow Creek were long gone, torn down, after Harrington's trial, and replaced by a small park where children played and families gathered for community celebrations. But the lessons learned in that dark time remained lessons about courage and compassion, about the power of love to overcome hatred, and about the extraordinary things that could happen when people chose to see each other's humanity rather than their differences. As the Blackwood family settled in for another peaceful evening in their rebuilt home, surrounded by the evidence of their shared success and united by bonds that had been forged in crisis and strengthened through triumph, they knew that their story was far from over. It was, in fact, just beginning.